October 23, 1988. 41-year-old Peggy Carr was waitressing at a local restaurant in Alturas, Florida, when her heart suddenly began racing and her palms began to sweat. On March 3, 1989, about 5 months later, Peggy Carr would lose the fight with her sickness and pass away. The case remained a mystery until a brave undercover investigation into the strange illness and death of Peggy Carr revealed a sinister plot to take out an entire family. Peggy Carr and her family lived in Alturas, a small, closely knit community in Polk County. With a population of just over 4,000, Alturas is known for its peaceful ambience and beautiful orange groves. Today, Alturas has a violent crime rate of 21.8%, lower than the national average of 22.7%. This makes it a relatively safer neighborhood than most communities in the U.S. But in 1988, when the events in today's case take place, Alturas was a much safer place. The type of place where leaving your front door open at night was not a problem, and neighbors looked out for each other. Born in 1947, Peggy Carr never had a life easy. Her parents were deaf and dirt poor, so from a young age she had to go out and find work that could put food on the table for her family. But with her minimal education, Peggy could hardly find any good jobs. The ones that she did find paid extremely low or were very dangerous, like waitressing jobs at isolated truck stops on the highway. Still, she did her best to make ends meet and had a positive outlook. Peggy also developed a very tough personality to deal with the hazards of her job, such as drunken men looking to prey on a woman waitressing at an isolated spot in the middle of the night. Peggy's hard exterior made it almost impossible for her to find a romantic partner for a long time. But eventually a man whose identity remains unknown would win her heart and she would get married to him. Over the next couple of years, Peggy and her husband would have 3 children, Yelena, Alan, and Dwayne. The couple worked hard to provide for their family, and it seemed things were finally going right for Peggy. But soon, Peggy started to have issues with her husband, and before long the marriage would come crashing down. By the mid-1980s, Peggy was in her mid-30s, a single mother working jobs to raise 3 children. Although she tried to keep a positive attitude at work, Peggy grew increasingly sad and lonely. Life had been hard on her, and it just didn't seem like things would ever get better. As her kids grew up, they started to notice how sad and lonely their mother was, and they wished she would meet someone, fall in love, and be happy again. By late 1987, her children's wish came true. Peggy met a man named Perlin Carr, whom everyone called Pi. Pi, like Peggy, had recently divorced his wife. He also had 2 teenage children, and he worked at a local phosphate mining company in Alturas, Florida. Peggy and Pi hit it off when they met, mainly because they were both strict people who did not condone nonsense from others. When Peggy and Pi started dating, Peggy's children noticed a significant improvement in her mood. She was happier, lighter on her feet, and more relaxed. By April 1988, Peggy and Pi delighted their children with the news that they were getting married. Peggy and her 3 kids moved into Pi's home in Alturas, Florida after the wedding. Although Pi's home was small and 4 new people made it even tighter, the blended family seemed to work out well. The family had 2 big dogs, 5 children got along well, and they were just happy to see their parents. But just a few months after they got married, Peggy and Pi began to have some marital issues. On top of their issues, Peggy had begun hearing rumors that Pi was still seeing his ex-wife, so they grew increasingly distant from each other. Around the time that Peggy and Pi's issues started, their 2 dogs suddenly became violently ill. They were howling in pain, losing weight rapidly, and their fur started falling out. It seemed like the dogs may have come down with a strange disease, or they might have ingested a poison. Before long, both dogs passed away, further plunging the Carr household into a gloomy atmosphere. Peggy and Pi continued to have daily issues that drove them further apart. In early October 1988, Peggy and her children had to move out of Pi's house for a week to stay at a motel because Peggy and Pi's fights had reached a point where they couldn't stand each other. The children also began taking sides with their respective parents, so the once happy family was now being torn apart. On October 23, 1988, Pi decided that he wanted to go on an unplanned hunting trip to get away for the day. Peggy and her kids had returned to the home by this time, so Peggy could be with the kids while Pi went on his trip. Once Pi left, Peggy and her daughter, Yelena, prepared to go to work. They were both waitresses at a local diner, and they had morning shifts on that particular day. As Peggy waited tables and attended to customers, she suddenly began to feel her heart racing erratically. That morning, Peggy was not doing any heavy lifting or stressful work. The only thing she was carrying were the trays holding customers' orders. Peggy thought she should just take it easy and her heart would stop beating so fast. And before long, she started to feel this tingling sensation in her arms and legs, and her palms started to sweat. Still wondering why she was feeling this way, it suddenly occurred to Peggy that she might be having a heart attack. But rather than panicking or becoming hysterical, Peggy tried to calm herself down. She went to the staff restroom and washed her face and hands, then slipped into the staff break room to relax for a bit. As she was relaxing, Yelena noticed that her mother had gone into the break room, so she went to check on her. Peggy calmly said she felt she might be having a heart attack and that she would go home and wait it out. Yelena was immediately alarmed at the idea that her mother could be having a heart attack, but she was not surprised at Peggy's calm demeanor. She knew Peggy was not fond of raising false alarms or panicking unnecessarily, so she believed if Peggy said she would sleep off a heart attack, then there wasn't anything to worry about, but she did make her mother promise that if she started feeling worse, then she would go to the hospital. Peggy informed the manager that she would be taking the rest of the day off because of how she was feeling, and Yelena promised to check up on her as soon as she finished her shift. When Peggy got home, she found the house empty. The kids were still at school and Pi was still away on his trip, so she went to her bedroom to lie down. After a few hours, Peggy's 17-year-old son, Dwayne, returned from school to find his mother lying in bed. The sight of Peggy taking a nap in the middle of the day was so strange to Dwayne that he immediately knew something was wrong. Peggy never took naps, not even when she was ill. With concern written all over his face, Dwayne asked Peggy if she was all right, and Peggy said she was. But just as he turned to leave the bedroom, Peggy suddenly blurted out she was not fine and felt horrible. She said that it felt like fire was being pumped through her arms and legs, and the pain was so blinding that she could barely even speak. At this, Dwayne's suspicions were confirmed. His mother was not a dramatic person, so if she said this was the most painful thing she had ever felt, Dwayne knew she had to get to the hospital immediately. Luckily, Pi returned home from his hunting trip just then, and Dwayne immediately told him that they had to take Peggy to the hospital immediately. But to his shock, Pi merely waved him off, saying that he was sure that Peggy was just suffering from the flu, and she would be fine in a day or two. Dwayne immediately called his sister and asked her to return home so she could take Peggy to the hospital, since Pi was not planning on doing so himself. When Yelena arrived at the house, Dwayne had to carry Peggy to the car because her condition had gotten so bad that she could not even walk or stand. When they got to the hospital, Peggy was wheeled into the intensive care unit to begin receiving treatment. And this was where the real problem began, because neither Dwayne nor Yelena had any idea about what might have caused Peggy to feel the way she was. By now, Peggy could only lie down, moaning in pain. Her heart was still racing, her limbs still felt like they were on fire, and she was now nauseous and vomiting. The doctors ran a number of tests on Peggy, trying to determine what was wrong with her, but all the tests turned up negative or showed nothing was wrong with her. This seriously baffled the doctors. Peggy was writhing in pain, and it seemed like her ailment came out of nowhere, because they could not find anything wrong with her from the tests they had run. With no better alternative, the doctors decided to keep her in the hospital and observe her. After about 3 days of being in the hospital, Peggy's symptoms seemed to improve. Although she felt bouts of extreme pain in her limbs and her heart was still racing occasionally, she could now talk, eat, and move around a bit. Since she seemed to be on the mend, the doctors decided to discharge her so she could fully recuperate at home. When Peggy got home on October 26, 1988, she lay in bed to recover and she felt herself improving. But within 24 hours, all the symptoms were back again, much stronger this time. Her arms and legs felt like they were on fire. Her heart was racing. She was nauseous, and she had lost so much weight that she looked like a shadow of herself. But rather than go to the hospital, Peggy's family knew that even the doctors had no idea what was wrong with her, so they thought it might be better for her to stay home. But right before their eyes, it seemed like Peggy was coming apart at the seams. She couldn't walk, talk, eat, or even sleep. She could only lie in bed writhing in pain and occasionally screaming into her pillow because of the intense pain she was feeling. Finally, on October 30th, her family relented and decided to take her to the hospital again. When Peggy arrived at the hospital, the doctors remembered her from the previous week and also remembered that they had been unable to determine the cause of her symptoms. But just to be sure they were leaving no stone unturned, the doctors decided to run another batch of tests on Peggy to see if they could find something they had earlier missed. They tested for food poisoning, thinking Peggy had ingested something tearing up her insides, and they tested for all the common diseases that might affect a 41-year-old woman. But the test results again showed nothing was wrong with Peggy. Once again, the doctors had no better alternative than to put Peggy in a room and observe her. As Peggy lay in her room, other patients and hospital staff could hear her screams of pure agony echo through the hospital halls. By October 31st, Peggy had begun slipping in and out of consciousness, but the situation was about to get even worse. Peggy's son, Dwayne, and Pi's son, 16-year-old Travis, were rushed into the same hospital that Peggy was at. They had suddenly begun suffering the same symptoms that Peggy had been suffering for over a week. Like Peggy, the doctors ran several tests on Dwayne and Travis to determine what was wrong with them, but they also came up with nothing. But suddenly, Dr. Robert Van Hook, one of the neurologists working on Peggy, noticed something about their symptoms that immediately stood out to him. Peggy, Dwayne, and Travis were losing their hair, and combined with the other symptoms they were feeling, the neurologist had a hunch that he knew the exact cause of their illness. But first he sent for a very specific test kit to confirm his suspicions. When the test kit arrived and the neurologist tested Peggy, Dwayne, and Travis, the test results were positive. All three had ingested a rare and expensive chemical called thallium-1 nitrate. Thallium-1 nitrate is a tasteless, colorless, odorless metal that was once used in rat poison, but was banned because of how toxic it was to humans. The average human has a small quantity of thallium in their system, but even the slightest increase in that naturally occurring amount can have fatal consequences, with symptoms like severe pain in the hands and legs, nausea, hair loss, weight loss, and erratic heartbeat. Peggy had 50,000 times the naturally occurring amount of thallium in her body, while Dwayne and Travis each had about 20,000 times that amount. Doctors decided to test the rest of the family, and they all had elevated levels of thallium in their system, though not as much as that of Peggy, Dwayne, and Travis. Before the test results, the doctors had not previously considered that Peggy and her son's cases were a potential crime. But with the test results showing that Peggy and her family may have been poisoned, they began to see the case in a new light. The hospital contacted the Polk County Sheriff's Office to let them know about the case and the fact that there was a potential crime at play there. Nobody knew where Peggy and her boys had come into contact with such a rare and expensive chemical. Was it accidental or were they deliberately poisoned? While the police began their investigation, things looked grim for Peggy. Although there was a cure for thallium poisoning, Peggy's body had been so completely ravaged by the poison that even if treatment had been administered, she would not likely survive. Doctors told her that the only thing they could do was to make her as comfortable as possible while they waited for the poison to take her life. But there was hope for the boys. They could begin receiving treatment and everyone hoped it would be fast enough to save their lives. A few days after Peggy received the news that she could not be saved, she slipped into a coma. She would remain in the coma for the next 4 months until March 3, 1989, when her family decided to take her off life support. After spending 2 months in the hospital, Dwayne made a full recovery. Travis would remain hospitalized for 6 months before eventually recovering from the poisoning. But tragically, he could never walk again because of the extreme damage the poison had caused to his limbs. For Sheriff Judd from the Polk County Sheriff's Office, Peggy and her son's case was very delicate, regardless of whether they were intentionally poisoned. If someone had poisoned them, they had a murder and several attempted murders on their hands and a killer at large. If they had ingested the poison by accident, then there was the likelihood that the source of the poison was still out there for other Alturas residents to ingest. Either way, the stakes were high, so Sheriff Judd was determined to get to the bottom of it. Investigators tested every single item and surface in the car house for thallium, but all the results came back negative. Meanwhile, as news got out that the Carr family had been poisoned, and the police did not know where the poison came from. Panic began to spread throughout Alturas. People were afraid that the poison might have come from their groundwater, or that they could even already be dying and not know about it. So investigators examined the car's well water, which was connected to at least 2 other houses, but they found nothing. Also, no one else in the community had come down with the symptoms that Peggy and her sons suffered. At this point, Prosecutor John Aguero from the Florida State's Attorney's Office joined the investigation and started to look into pesticides, insecticides, or any other plant spray where thallium might have come from. Alturas had many orange groves, and there might have been thallium in the chemicals used to preserve the trees. But the test results all came back negative. While scouring the car house to find what Peggy and her sons could have eaten or drunk that could have contained the poison, police discovered their first break in the case: an 8-pack of Coca-Cola bottles with lids that had been tampered with. They immediately sent the bottles for testing, and when the results came back, it showed that the Coca-Cola bottles had high levels of thallium. Someone had put thallium inside the drinks and then replaced the covers. The first obvious lead was that this had become a case of product tampering from the bottling company's end. If it was, there could be a national thallium poisoning crisis because practically everyone drank Coca-Cola. When Altura's residents heard about this new lead, many became scared of drinking Coke. However, as the investigation proceeded, it came out that the poisoning did not come from the bottling company or the stores that sold Coca-Cola in Alturas. This led investigators to one chilling conclusion. The bottles had been tampered with, but it had been done by someone who deliberately targeted the Carr family. The prime suspect was Pi himself. On October 23rd, the day Peggy had begun experiencing the symptoms, Pi had suddenly decided to go on a hunting trip that kept him away for most of the day. Investigators believe this might have been his way of trying to cover his tracks. There was also the fact that Pi worked at a phosphate mining company, so he could have access to a chemical as expensive and rare as thallium. Coupled with the fact that Peggy and Pi had begun having marital issues, it seemed very possible that Pi was the one who poisoned Peggy. However, this theory had some loopholes. Pi and his children had also tested positive for thallium poisoning, meaning they drank from the Coke that Peggy and her children drank. So if Pi truly wanted Peggy dead, it seemed more realistic that he would have planned it in such a way that she was the only one who ingested the poison. Or at least he would have made sure that his children did not ingest it. Still, police brought Pi in for questioning. Pi told them that he knew nothing about how the poison got into his home, swearing that the hunting trip was coincidental. As he was talking, he mentioned something offhandedly that did not seem like a big deal then. But when police followed up on Pi's tip, they would find the next big clue to help them piece this puzzling case together and discover who had poisoned Peggy and her family. As Pi sat in the interrogation room trying to defend himself, he suddenly remembered something that happened a few weeks before Peggy fell ill. Peggy's son, Dwayne, had gone to check the mail one day when he found a printed note addressed to Pi. The note read, "You and your so-called family have exactly 2 weeks to move out of the state of Florida or you will all die. This is no joke." At the time, Peggy and Pi had dismissed the death threat as a prank by some mischievous teenagers. But now that the entire family had been poisoned, it seemed that the note might not have been a joke. It might have been from the person who poisoned the Carrs. As police began investigating the note, they noticed a few things that immediately told them that whoever had sent the note knew Pi and his family well. For example, the sender had spelled Pi's name correctly as Pye rather than Pie, as most people would spell it. Armed with this new lead, police began interviewing hundreds of Altura's residents trying to find out who might have had a reason to hate the Carrs and want them dead. But in a small and closely knit community like Altura's, neighbors looked out for each other. Police could not find a single person with a motive to hurt the Carrs, so they decided to ask FBI Special Agent Mark Young, a profiler with hundreds of cases under his belt, to help build a profile of the likely perpetrator of this crime. Agent Young believed that a person using poison to kill was likely someone who had been wronged and wanted to correct the wrong they believed had been done to them. Also, the specific type of thallium used to poison the Coca-Cola bottles was the unnoticeable type. It was expensive, not something you could pop into the store and buy. This showed that the perpetrator was intelligent, with a significant knowledge of chemistry. With this in mind, investigators ruled out suspects until they reached the Carrs' neighbors, George Trapal and his wife Diana Carr. George Trapal was born on January 23, 1949. He was a chemist and computer programmer with multiple degrees. His wife, Diana Carr, who had no relationship with Pi, was a successful orthopedic surgeon with a private practice in Alturas. While Diana had a very strong personality and was more outgoing, George was a quiet man who barely left the house, but he wasn't always so laid back. In the 1970s, when George was a student at Clemson University, South Carolina, he was fond of doing drugs and was always willing to share his substances with others, with or without their consent. George and his friends formed a habit of picking up hitchhikers and giving them drug-laced brownies or cookies just to see how they would react. In 1975, he was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison for running a large methamphetamine or meth lab. An interesting thing about George's meth cooking process was that one of the byproducts was thallium. George also had a habit of studying police manuals. He considered himself an expert on crime scene procedures. George and Diana were not exactly the best neighbors to live with. They always had problems with Peggy and Pi and their children, from complaining that they were laughing or playing music too loud, to complaining that their dogs were barking too loud. Diana and George found the Carrs annoying and obnoxious, and although Peggy tried to be amicable, they were never on good terms. Diana especially hated the Carrs. She would always complain about them. George, on the other hand, seemed nicer. He smiled and waved at them, and did not complain as much as his wife did. But secretly, George hated the Carrs as much as his wife did. In March 1988, George reported Pi to the local zoning board for violating zoning laws, as Pi had tried to convert his garage into an apartment for his stepdaughter, Yelena, and her baby girl. 2 days before Peggy fell sick, Diana stormed to the Carr house to complain as usual. When they told her off, she left shouting, "You won't get away with this. This isn't over." Aside from being very successful in their respective fields, George and Diana were very intelligent people. So intelligent that they were members of a prestigious organization called Mensa. Mensa was founded in 1946 by a barrister named Roland Barrel and his friend Dr. Lance Ware. It is an exclusive club for people who fall within the upper 2% of the general population on a special IQ test and are highly intelligent. To gain entry into Mensa, applicants have to pass a series of special IQ tests, and even passing those tests does not always guarantee admission into the club. Once they are admitted, members regularly hold meetings, discussion panels, debates, seminars, and other hangouts to share ideas and engage in stimulating conversation. Although Mensa was originally based in England, it has branches worldwide. The Florida chapter of Mensa, to which George and Diana belonged, regularly held monthly fun, mentally stimulating meetings called Murder Mystery Weekend. Members would take turns planning a crime mystery that the rest of the members would try to solve for an entire weekend. For that weekend, all the members would go to a secluded location like an inn or hotel where they would stay and play their parts in solving the murder mystery. In April 1989, a few weeks after Peggy's death, the Mensa Florida chapter welcomed a new member, a middle-aged woman named Sherry Gwynn. Sherry had moved to Florida after escaping an abusive marriage in Texas. Once she joined Mensa, she found a sense of community and immediately became close with George and Diana. The month that Sherry joined Mensa was George and Diana's turn to plan the murder mystery that would be solved for that month's Murder Mystery Weekend. George, now 40 years old, took this role very seriously, and he spent weeks trying to create the perfect crime. Their Murder Mystery Weekend was very successful, as all the members had a hard time trying to solve the crime and identify the murder weapon. But when George finally disclosed the murder weapon to the group, Sherry became fascinated. She would spend hours talking to George about it, trying to learn everything he knew about the murder weapon, how it would play out if it were used in real life. George, who was often overshadowed by his wife, was flattered by the attention he received from Sherry, and he was happy to answer all her questions. In December 1989, Diana moved her medical practice from Alturas to a neighboring town called Sebring, so she and George decided to move there too. When Sherry heard about it, she immediately asked if she could rent their house since they weren't selling it yet. As soon as Sherry moved into the house, almost the entire Alturas police department descended upon the house. Sherry Gwynn was not, in fact, a divorced woman who fled Texas after escaping an abusive marriage. Her real name was Susan Gorek, and she was an undercover policewoman assigned to investigate George Trapal and Diana Carr. During their initial investigation, police interviewed George. Although he seemed meek and reserved, when asked if he knew anybody who would want to hurt the Carrs, he said, "Someone must have wanted them to move out of the neighborhood." This statement echoed the death threat Pi had received weeks before Peggy fell ill. When police discovered the altercations between the Trapals and Carrs, their suspicion of George grew. Additionally, he fit the FBI profile for the perpetrator: a white, extremely intelligent male with a passive personality who avoided conflict. Susan Gorek had been assigned to investigate them undercover. When Susan discovered that the murder weapon George used to plan his murder mystery was thallium poisoning, she knew George was most likely the killer. Also, the pamphlet he printed describing the murder in this mystery read, "When a death threat appears on the doorstep, prudent people throw out all their food and watch what they eat. Hardly anyone dies from magic. Most items on the doorstep are just a neighbor's way of saying, 'I don't like you. Move or else.'" So as soon as he and Diana left their house, she called for backup and ordered a search of the house. In the garage, the police found a treasure trove of chemicals, including thallium. They also discovered that George often brewed his own beer, so he had machines to remove bottle caps and replace them. Investigators determined that George had finally had enough of his neighbors, so he decided to get rid of them. He fit the profile, had the means and motive to commit the crime, and had the opportunity to sneak a case of Coca-Cola into the Carr's kitchen. Alturas was a community where people hardly ever locked their doors, and casually strolling by to say hello to a neighbor was normal. With all this evidence, the police had enough to bring George in for questioning. When George arrived at the Alturas police station, he appeared shy and avoided eye contact with the officers interviewing him. But faced with all the evidence, he maintained that he had nothing to do with the poisoning, but investigators were not buying it. On April 5, 1990, Trapal was indicted on 1 count of first-degree murder, 6 counts of attempted first-degree murder, 7 counts of poisoning food or water, and 1 count of tampering with a consumer product. In January 1991, George went on trial for these 15 criminal counts, including first-degree murder, 6 counts of attempted murder, poisoning food or water, and product tampering. After a trial that lasted for 4 weeks, from January 7th to February 7th, 1991, the jury returned a guilty verdict against George on all counts. He was sentenced to death. Today, George remains on death row at the Union Correctional Institution in Rayford, Florida. George has filed several appeals challenging the FBI's investigation procedure and the credibility of the state's witnesses, but all his appeals have been denied. Diana Carr was never charged with anything. She would eventually divorce George in 1996 and remarry. Peggy's children, Alan, Yelena, and Dwayne, have since moved on, knowing the evil mastermind who killed their mother, paralyzed their stepbrother Travis, and nearly killed Dwayne, has been made to face the law. Peggy's life was very difficult for a long time, and just when things were about to start getting good for her, her life was violently snatched by a neighbor who just didn't like her and her family. At least her family can move on knowing she got justice. Police sirens were heard throughout the Denver neighborhood on October 5, 1996, in response to a call about an apartment in the 1900 block of East 17th Avenue. Terry Turochek, a 35-year-old woman, was found dead inside. Terry was found by the police to have been strangled and had suffered serious head injuries. What could have happened between Terry and her attacker to cause her tragic death? And who could have committed such an evil act? With a population of 700,000, Denver, Colorado has a vibrant mix of history and culture that draws many visitors to its many museums. With a wealth of historical and recreational sites, this city seamlessly blends the old and the new. The small-town feel of Denver's neighborhoods is reflected in the welcoming locals who are known for their adventurous spirit and who frequently know their neighbors by name. However, Denver faces urban challenges, such as having one of the highest crime rates in the country. This problem casts a shadow over its tight-knit neighborhoods. The unsolved Terry Turochek case from 1996 serves as a sobering reminder of this darker side of the city's existence. Terry Turochek, who was born on May 14, 1961, was from Michigan's vast countryside. She was the daughter of James C. Turoczek, a brave Vietnam War veteran and honorable surgeon in the U.S. Air Force, possessed a resilient spirit as a child. While the specifics of Terry's mother, Marlene Elsekish, are still unknown, her father, James, was the epitome of a loving father to Terry despite his tough exterior as a military man. The fact that Terry wasn't an only child is well known. A few years later after her birth, her younger brother, James Turoczek Jr., joined the family, and the two of them quickly developed a strong and close bond that lasted well into adulthood. As time unfolded, accepted motherhood with grace. She graciously with a man named Douglas in Oakland in 1979, and the couple was blessed with 3 kids. Her kids' names are unknown, but one thing was undeniable. Terry was a fantastic mother. James Jr. often recalled her maternal tendencies. Terry was always praised for the attention and love she gave to her children. As the years passed, Terry separated from her husband and had made a home at 1900 East 17th Avenue in Denver, Colorado. She had a complicated love life. Although she was in a primary relationship, there were rumors that she was open to other options. Terry's life was in a stable period with friends, family, and the typical ups and downs. She was maximizing her lifetime, but because of the rise and fall of life, it is impossible to predict what lies ahead. Therefore, no one could have predicted that Terry's happy times were coming to an end. Denver's residents appeared to be going about their daily lives on Friday, October 4, 1996, unaware of the impending tragedy. Terry Turoczek completed her day at work and left for home with the intention of spending the evening with friends. She relished the solitude of her empty apartment while her kids were away. She got ready to partake in Denver's exciting nightlife as dusk fell. Around 8 o'clock, left her apartment. Her spirit coexisted peacefully with the city's spirit. There are traces of Terry's night scattered here and there. Around 11:30 p.m., a neighbor saw Terry coming home. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but time and events have a way of taking everyone by surprise. The next day, on Saturday, October 5th, the early morning sun casts long shadows over Terry's apartment building, which had become silent. Strangely, Terry's apartment door remained open. After hours passed, a worried neighbor didn't see the open door until the noon sun reached its highest point. He might have assumed she had overslept or that she was taking the shower. Just to be sure, he peered into Terry's apartment and shouted out her name, but he heard no response despite his voice resonating throughout the living room. Terry was nowhere to be found when a quick search of the living room and kitchen was conducted. The neighbor then made an attempt to do a last stop at her bedroom. He, however, couldn't believe what he saw when he arrived. Terry, who he had just seen the previous evening when she was vivacious and alive, now laid lifeless on the floor of her bedroom. His fear increased. He scrambled for his phone as he hurried outside and dialed 911. His voice trembled in shock as he spoke to the operator. Police sirens could be heard in the distance, getting louder and louder until there was a discord outside Terry's apartment. Police officers who had mastered composure intervened to take control while masking their internal dread. The scene, which featured a life lost too soon, a shocked community, and a family left in agony, was all too common. When Terry Turoczek's body was found, her case was launched immediately. The entire community was affected, not just her family. Detectives from the Denver Police Department led the investigation to find out what caused this sinister discovery. They understood the significance of the scene in front of them right away. The bedroom depicts a violent story. There were obvious indications of a struggle, suggesting that Terry had fought hard for her life. In an effort to fill in the blanks of that fateful night, neighbors mentioned disturbances between 1 o'clock and 1:30 m. The door to Terry's apartment was obviously left open, a spooky invitation to the horror inside, but nobody had reported seeing anyone leave. Detectives speculated that the perpetrator might have known Terry or had gained her trust in order to take advantage of it in the most wicked way, given that there was no sign of forced entry. The medical examiner, Dr. T. Henry, had the grim duty of looking over Terry's body. The outcomes were unexpected. Terry had been severely assaulted in addition to being killed. Her death was attributed to strangulation, but there was also evidence of blunt force trauma, making for a horrifying end to a life that had otherwise been full of promise. A hair found on Terry's thighs stood out as detectives searched Terry's body. They hoped that this small strand of hair would hold the key to discovering who killed her. Investigators connected with Terry's friends and neighbors to piece together the story, and it didn't take long for perplexing tidbits of information to start to emerge. Around 11:30 p.m., Terry was last seen entering her apartment, and a neighbor noticed she wasn't alone. She was accompanied by an African-American man with a unique afro. It was unknown if he was a friend or enemy, but he was the last person seen with Terry. The timeline was further complicated when a different neighbor reported hearing noises coming from Terry's apartment around 12:30 a.m. It's interesting to note that Terry was observed knocking on another neighbor's door at 1 o'clock a.m., appearing to be hurt and pleading asking for money. Could this be connected to the man she was seen earlier with, Terry's boyfriend, whose identity was kept private, provided the information that was the most revealing? While he had a story from the week before that raised questions, he had an alibi for the night of the murder. Terry and her boyfriend had been robbed and assaulted inside Terry's apartment by 3 unidentified African-American men. Was this incident related to her eventual homicide in any way? The detectives were plagued by that question. The weeks that followed saw the pursuit of leads. Terry was seen with a mysterious man who later became a person of interest. Was he related to the assault from the previous week? Or was Terry's request for cash that night somehow connected to him? Despite the police's best efforts, the reliable evidence required to identify a suspect eluded them. Even though a key suspect was brought in and subjected to questioning and DNA testing, disappointment sets in when the results were revealed. It did not match his DNA. With each passing day, the community's suffering grew worse. For clarification and some semblance of justice, the neighborhood looked to the detectives. The loss of Terry left her family devastated, and they clung to the hope that the offender would be caught and punished. But as the weeks turned into months, the once shining trail started to fade. Despite their best efforts, the detectives had to face the harsh possibility that they might never catch Terry's killer. Sadly, leads that had once shown promise dwindled, and the case became unproductive. However, the cold and seemingly unsolvable case experienced a sudden and unexpected resurgence in 2004. Time's fails, which had concealed clues and obscured the way to justice, were now starting to lift. Nearly 10 years after the horrifying incident, in August of that year, there was a significant development. The hit was detected by the Cody's DNA system, a comprehensive database that contains DNA profiles from all over the country. It matched the DNA evidence that had been taken years earlier from Terry's body. For the investigators, this DNA had always been a loose end, a piece of the puzzle that wouldn't fit anywhere. But now there was a lead. The investigation into this reopened case was given to Detective Dixie, an experienced detective. She was determined to follow this new lead and see where the investigation would go, and this DNA trail led them right to Ricky Dawson, thanks to her analytical mind and methodical approach. Ricky had experience with the law. His DNA was already present in the Cody's database, which suggested that he had a criminal history. An African-American man named Ricky Dawson unexpectedly found himself at the center of this investigation. After many years, the Terry Turochik case was once again the focus of the attention of the law enforcement community. Now that they had a new lead and a rekindled seal, it was hoped that this new lead would finally put an end to a troubling chapter in the city's past and bring justice to a person who had been wronged. With a name and a face to work with, Detective Dixie started attempting to understand the relationship between Terry and Dawson. Did they have a mutual relationship? Was there a reason behind the killing? Were there any additional pieces of proof or witnesses that the initial investigation might have missed? The case, which was once a terrifying puzzle covered in a layer of mystery, had changed into a maze of connections that were just waiting to be explored. As Detective Dixie dug deeper, it became clear that the task at hand was to confirm the DNA match, establish the story, and create a solid case against the new prime suspect. The Denver streets, where rumors and theories about the case once circulated, now awaited news over the case. They eagerly anticipated the day when they would declare Terry had received justice. The majority of the city was upbeat, but there were still many obstacles to be overcome. Although compelling, DNA evidence is not the be-all and end-all of a criminal case. Finding a suspect is one thing, but establishing their guilt beyond a reasonable doubt is quite another. On January 24, 1961, in Florida, Ricky Dawson, a man whose life seemed to contain both darkness and light, was born. In 2004, he was 43 years old. It indicates that he was 35 at the time of Terry Turachek's tragic death in 1996. Terry wasn't his only link to the dark, though. Dawson had his own difficulties when he was younger. There were complications throughout his childhood. It's been said that a person's behavior as a child often provides a window into their future, and Ricky was no exception. His marital status, education, and other personal information are still unknown. But his criminal record is one thing that stands out. The criminal activity that Dawson is involved in is not just in Terry's case. His DNA was discovered to match an unnamed profile from a terrifying case that occurred in Seattle in 2000. Debbie Cascio, a 40-year-old woman, was his victim. The tragic circumstances surrounding Terry's death and Debbie's are similar. Like Terry, Debbie had multiple blunt force traumas and was in pain. Debbie was strangled and had multiple blunt force injuries like Terry as well. The unfortunate relationship between the two women and Ricky Dawson attracted the attention of the law. Once more, the city and Debbie's devoted daughter, Tabitha Johnson, both worked to preserve her memory. As a gesture by the Homeless Remembrance Project to ensure Debbie's story is never forgotten, a leaf of remembrance at the Seattle Justice Center bears her name. Tabitha, who was only 11 years old when her mother died, has been a model of tenacity. She recalls memories of her mother, including times spent at the beach or creating art with glass. Even after becoming a mother herself, Tabitha is still grieving Debbie's loss. Despite her desire for closure and justice, the specifics of her mother's case are still unknown because the Seattle police haven't disclosed more information. The criminal activities of Ricky Dawson continued beyond Seattle and Denver. In 2004, he ended up in Florida's police custody. At that time, Denver police learned that a DNA match connected him to the 1996 Terry Turachek cold case. While in Florida, he admitted guilt to second-degree murder in exchange for a 25-year prison term. Now he is charged with first-degree murder in connection with the Terry Turachek case in Denver. The investigation into Terry Turachek's murder accelerated as soon as Ricky Dawson's name appeared. Detectives searched for any mention of Ricky in the case files and interview transcripts from the initial investigation. Although they weren't able to find his name right away, they were in for a surprise. Ricky's description of the man Harry was with the night she was killed matched that provided by her neighbors. Ricky's criminal history was quickly revealed, and it was shocking. He was a persistent offender. His name was associated with a long list of crimes. Detectives recognized him as a key suspect in Terry Turachek's case and knew they needed to speak with him. At the Suwannee Correctional Facility in Florida, where Ricky Dawson was already incarcerated, they came face to face with him in December 2004. Finding out what Ricky knew about Terry and proving his involvement in her tragic demise were detectives' stated objectives. During the interview, another intriguing lead emerged. A friend of Ricky's whose name was withheld gave his account about the night Terry was killed. Terry was well acquainted with Ricky's friend. He acknowledged spending time in her apartment with her and Ricky and even confirmed being there the night she was reported killed. He claimed that all three of them had used drugs. Even though he said he left at midnight, he wasn't aware of what happened next. The puzzle was beginning to come together. A path had now been set out in front of the detectives. They performed an important DNA test. The new DNA samples obtained from Ricky were compared to the major DNA profile of the hair discovered on Terry's body, and there was a match. With this concrete proof, Ricky Dawson's involvement in Terry's death was established. But unexpectedly, no charges were brought against him for her killing right away. Some speculated that this was because Ricky had already served about 20 years of his current sentence. As a result, Terry's case sat idle for more than 10 more years. 14 years later, a new hope for justice surfaced. Detective John McGrill from the Denver Police Cold Case Unit was tasked with reviewing the case. McGrail examined the case's details and came to the conclusion that the evidence present was quite convincing. In some ways, the case appeared to be settled. In order to cover all bases, he decided to submit the evidence for additional laboratory testing in December 2018. This included evidence gathered from the crime scene and Terry's post-mortem examination results. By August 2019, the DNA evidence findings had produced a solid match. The wheels of justice began to turn more quickly. Ricky Dawson, the Ricky who had been serving time in Florida's prison for a different crime, was the only person in whom the puzzle pieces pointed. With the fresh evidence in hand, it was obvious that it was time to hold Dawson accountable for the murder of Terry. Time travel to January 26, 2023, which was an important day in the investigation. Ricky Dawson was officially charged with the first-degree murder of Terry Turacek, and an arrest warrant was issued for him. At the age of 62, Ricky discovered himself in a more difficult legal situation. Even though he was already detained in Florida, justice did not stand still. The Denver Police Department obtained his extradition so that he could answer for his actions in Denver. On February 23rd, when Ricky learned of the allegations against him, the seriousness of the situation hit him. March 23rd, 2023 was designated as the date of the court appearance, which was eagerly anticipated. Many people anticipate Ricky Dawson will be found guilty for his role in Terry's tragic death. Despite the fact that the court's final decision has not yet been made public, they felt this way because of the mounting evidence against him. James Turacek, Terry's brother, never fully recovered from the pain of losing his sister in 1996. He struggled for 27 long years, torn between hope and despair, wondering if Terry's premature death would ever bring about justice. James, however, was overcome by a wave of emotions after hearing the recent news of an arrest in relation to the murder of his sister. James spoke to the media about his unwavering dedication to his sister's case and how he had always held on to the hope that the truth would eventually surface. James became more aware of the seriousness of the situation when he learned that the alleged offender was being extradited to stand trial. He addressed the hole Terry's absence had left, calling it an irreplaceable loss that time would never fill. He often pondered the life experiences she passed up, particularly the joy of becoming a grandmother. James finally recalled that Terry had a contagious spirit that affected everyone she knew. James acknowledged that despite having a desire for forgiveness, he is still working on it. It is a challenging journey because the pain is still too recent. Above all else, he made clear that he wanted justice to win. James wants to see Terry's memory honored by the justice she deserved 52 years ago, by making sure Ricky Dawson faces the full force of the law and is imprisoned for the rest of his days. On June 5, 2000, at 1 p.m., Sharon Ankotz, a 54-year-old woman, was shot and killed at the John Butler Dry Cleaners on Easley Bridge Road. Additionally, there were no arrests made for an extended period of time, which caused complete panic in the neighborhood. The culprit remained unidentified for more than 20 years, but the investigation was revived in 2022 by a reconstituted cold case unit. A team of meticulous investigators and forensic specialists worked to unearth the long-hidden truth. They carefully re-interviewed both new and old witnesses and assessed forensic data. After 20 years, the murderer was finally apprehended. How did that fateful night's events transpire? Why did the investigators decide to reopen this long-closed case in the eyes of the justice system? Greenville County, South Carolina is a bustling and populous area. More people live there than in any other county in the state. The county seat, where important decisions are made, is located in Greenville. What distinguishes Greenville County is its emphasis on education. Greenville County is the largest school district in South Carolina. Students learn, develop, and make plans for the future here. Greenville County is more than just choices in schools. Another attraction is the natural beauty, which includes peaceful landscapes and undulating hills. This place has a very welcoming community. Tragedies, though, can happen even in this peaceful paradise. The unsolved case of Sharon Ankotz, which persisted for almost 20 years, left a lasting impression on the town. The 19th of October, 1945 saw the birth of Sharon Anschutz, daughter of Leslie Franklin Kellogg and Leona Rosetta Skester Prince. Sharon developed into a strong, driven adult. She brought warmth and a work ethic that was characteristic of the Midwest. Having grown up in northern Michigan, alongside her sisters, Gloria Hopkins, Sandra Sanders, and Leslie Kellogg, Sharon Anschutz grew up in Michigan. She also grew up alongside her brothers, Ivan Tucker and Marjorie Perrin Richard Kellogg. She inherited kindness and a desire to make the world a better place from her early years. At exactly 21 years old, on July 12, 1966, she gave birth to a son named Frank. Public access to her and her son's relationship is currently restricted. Sharon relocated to Greenville, South Carolina in her mid-40s, where she established herself and had additional children. She also had 2 other sons, Walter and Michael, and a daughter, Christina. Was employed at the John Butler Dry Cleaners on Easley Bridge Road, which would subsequently serve as the scene of a tragic incident. Locals knew the small dry cleaners on Easley Bridge Road. Neighbors chatted while dropping off or picking up their laundry at this communal hub. 54 years old Sharon Anschutz, the woman in charge of this dry cleaning establishment, was well known for her diligence and congenial demeanor. She was a beloved member of the Greenville community, having grown up in Michigan. Sadly, on June 5, 2000, was shot and killed during a robbery at her dry cleaning. Greenville County was forever altered by this tragedy. The killer of Sharon remained a mystery for more than 20 years. The quiet upstate town of Greenville, South Carolina, was horrified to learn of Sharon's horrific murder. On June 5, 2000, during the late summer twilight, dry cleaners were getting ready to close as the sun was setting, creating long shadows on the empty streets. Sharon arranged the counter as usual. She had no idea it would get dark on this typical evening. Among the friends and regulars that evening was an unexpected presence. A certain 44-year-old man had visited the dry cleaners. He occasionally performed strange tasks around the store, such as emptying the trash. His intentions on this fateful evening were, however, not pure. This man was going to rob the dry cleaners. He watched the company's activities in silence, waiting for the ideal moment to strike. With every task he completed in the days preceding the crime, he got closer to his malevolent objective. On the evening of June 5, 2000, he suddenly made contact with Sharon with malicious intent. Sharon stood up for herself and her dry cleaning company during a terrible ordeal. There was a gunshot at the end of the conflict that reverberated throughout the community for years. That fateful night, silence was shattered by a gunshot. The beautiful Sharon Anschutz was killed by a senseless act of violence. Her life of kindness and hard work came to an abrupt end when she was shot in the back. As the gunshot faded, the gravity of the situation hit home. Once the killer realized how serious his act was, he left shock, terror, and sadness in his wake. Tragically killed in a place where she had brought so much joy, Sharon lay behind the counter in the pool of her own blood. The neighborhood was shocked by the tragedy that night. At 1:30 p.m., a customer discovered her dead and called 911. The dry cleaners, which was once a cozy and welcoming place, turned into a somber reminder of the darkness that can be found anywhere. Sharon's work ethic and steadfastness were deeply mourned by her colleagues, friends, and family. While the murderer was at large, local authorities began a vigorous investigation. They wished to stop such a horrible act from occurring in their neighborhood, send Sharon's assailant to prison, and provide closure to her bereaved family. Despite their best efforts, the murder investigation into Sharon Anschutz stalled. In the dark, the killer had eluded capture. Following the disaster at John Butler Dry Cleaners in June 2000, Greenville County was in disbelief. Following the murder of the community's beloved Sharon Anschutz, justice had to be served. The early investigation into this horrific murder demonstrated the resolve of law enforcement, as well as the community's optimistic quest for answers. When first responders arrived, the investigation started. The offender was the subject of an instant manhunt by the Greenville County Sheriff's Office. A thorough search of the crime scene was conducted for evidence, and witnesses who lived nearby were questioned. It was clear from the beginning that solving this case would require unwavering perseverance. One of the detective's biggest problems early on in the case was the absence of a suspect. With minimal evidence, Sharon was killed in the shadows. Still, the investigation was shaped by the possibility of a robbery. According to early witness accounts, the intruder intended to loot the dry cleaners. It seemed as though Sharon Anschutz had been violently robbed while attempting to defend her business. As investigators tried to find the person responsible for this horrific act of violence, this information further complicated the case. It was necessary to gather and analyze copious amounts of evidence for the initial inquiry. Every square inch of the crime scene was examined in search of hints about the perpetrator. Investigators looked for physical evidence that might provide a breakthrough, such as DNA and fingerprints. Questions were asked of witnesses at the dry cleaners. Their crucial testimony provided important details about the pre- and post-crime activities. They described the events of that night, including Sharon Anschutz's terrifying encounter with her attacker. Sharon Anschutz, who touched many lives, was mourned in Greenville County while law enforcement conducted an investigation. Her co-workers, friends, and family were in mourning. The community stood by Sharon's family during the investigation and promised to pursue justice. The outcome of the case depended on their determination. As leads dwindled and witnesses grew more elusive, the case stagnated. Sharon's loved ones remembered her, but her killer remained a mystery. The case was eventually filed under cold case. Leads dried up, witnesses moved on, and the trail of the criminal became more bleak every day. The prolonged investigation caused suffering for Sharon's friends, family, and community. This terrible crime's perpetrator was unknown for more than 20 years. Victim Sharon Anschutz continues to exist. She was a representation of strength and hope. It was hope that justice would triumph and the truth would come to light. For more than 20 years, Greenville County, South Carolina was plagued by her cold case. A renewed quest for justice in the summer of 2022 brought this long-dormant investigation back to life. The tipping point was the new cold case unit of the Greenville County Sheriff's Office, which debuted in the summer of 2022. Sheriff Lewis established a specialized unit in 2020 to look into cases that remain unsolved, such as the Sharon Anschutz cold case. His objectives were to resurrect past investigations, assess the evidence, speak with witnesses again, and employ fresh techniques. The pursuit of justice for victims of unsolved crimes was revitalized by this cold case unit. The community was assured that every case would be taken seriously, and that no effort would be spared. The Sharon Anschutz cold case reinvestigation started by detectives reaching out to witnesses of the June 2000 incident at the dry cleaners in an attempt to gather information. They confronted witnesses whose memories had faded. Regardless, reconstructing the crime and the attacker's actions required careful consideration of their testimonies. These extra interviews shed light on the events of that evening. The murderer's meeting of Sharon Anschutz was revealed by witnesses. Their memories, though fading, were essential to solving the mystery. Technology and forensic evidence were scarce early in the case, but over time, forensic science developed. This gave the reinvestigation team the opportunity to assess the evidence with state-of-the-art techniques. Forensic specialists meticulously examined crime scene material using modern methodologies in order to uncover new information. Ballistic testing and DNA fingerprinting were repeated. Although exhausting, it resulted in a breakthrough. Old clues were re-examined and new leads surfaced as the investigation went on. Witnesses who were interviewed again disclosed the attacker's goals. The horrifying events that transpired at the dry cleaners were re-examined and determined to be an attempted robbery gone wrong. Detectives learned more about the crime as a result of this. Investigators also looked into the connections of Roger Keith Hudgens, the key suspect who died in 2008. Hudgens was a neighbor of the dry cleaners. Witness accounts and his connections within the establishment shed light on the murderer's activities. The breakthrough in the Sharon Anschutz cold case was the result of diligent work, fresh interviews, and advanced forensic analysis. Investigators determined that Sharon Anschutz was killed by 44-year-old Roger Keith Hudgens at the beginning of January 2023. Testimonies from witnesses and forensic evidence shed light on that fatal evening. Horrible things happened as a result of Hudgens' plan to rob the dry cleaners. In the Sharon Anschutz cold case, no one was taken into custody despite this effort. Hudgens is the culprit, the investigators concluded, but he passed away in 2008. It provided closure to the victim's family and addressed inquiries from the community. The crime and its aftermath will always be associated with Hudgens, even though he was never charged with it. Even though no one was arrested, Greenville County was prepared for the Sharon Anschutz cold case trial after 20 years of uncertainty. Justice had produced findings that would go to trial. Roger Keith Hudgens, the main suspect, went on trial even in death. His actions on that fateful day in June 2000 were gaining legal attention, even after he passed away in 2008. The personnel at the dry cleaners knew Hudgens, a local from Sharon Anschutz's tragic robbery. Witness accounts and forensic evidence would be used by the prosecution to discredit Hudgens. As the trial started, the courtroom was filled with anticipation. The prosecution meticulously gathered testimony from witnesses about that terrible night. They gave a detailed account of Hudgens and Sharon Anschutz meeting prior to the crime. The forensic evidence that was re-examined was crucial to the case. Experts in ballistics attested that Hudgens' weapon was used in the killing. His DNA was found at the crime scene, which provided strong evidence in his criminal case. To undermine the prosecution, the defense made a move. They questioned witness accounts, saying that memories had become hazy with time. To cast doubt, they also questioned the chain of custody for the evidence. Weeks of court cases, talks, and introspection led up to the moment of truth. The jury unanimously found Roger Keith Hudgens guilty of killing Sharon Anschutz. The verdict that provided closure to Sharon's family and confirmed the community's and law enforcement's commitment to justice reverberated throughout the courtroom. Despite his passing, Hudgens will always be associated with the senseless crime that left the town scarred. Roger Keith Hudgens was found guilty and his sentencing commenced. A sentence that was appropriate for the crime was what the prosecution sought. The defense, on the other hand, asked for mercy, pointing to Hudgens' innocence and lack of criminal history. The trial came to an end when Hudgens was found guilty of the tragedy that occurred that evening. Some criminals leave an indelible mark on the people they wronged. Roger Keith Hudgens' life was connected to Greenville County's most horrifying incident in the Sharon Anschutz cold case. Roger Keith Hudgens was familiar with Greenville County. Hudgens' birth date is September 13, 1955. He had a good local reputation. He was well known for frequenting the dry cleaners where the old case started. Hudgens performed strange jobs at the dry cleaners over the years. Every now and then, he removed the trash. On February 17, 2008, Roger Keith Hudgens passed away. His violent deed, which dates back years, left a legacy. He passed away due to medical issues. Any legal action against him was terminated by his death because he would never face justice. His name was still connected to the unsolved case of Sharon Anschutz. Even though he would never be held responsible, justice would always be associated with him and his deeds. Loretta Jones lived in Price at 468 E. 400S with her 4-year-old daughter, Heidi Jones. There she thrived to make ends meet for herself and her daughter. She was unmarried and young, but she gave her all for Heidi, who recalled most of the beautiful memories they had together. Loretta made most of the clothes Heidi wore as a kid, her dolls, and they lived a happy life together. But soon their happy life would end abruptly. On that warm summer night, kissed her mother goodnight, unknown whether it would be the last time she would see her alive. On the morning of July 31, 1970, Heidi Jones woke up to see her mother, Loretta, lying lifelessly on the living room floor of their home. Heidi, who was too young to comprehend the whole situation, went out of the house. Outside, she saw her neighbor, Sue and Hover, who was digging out worms at her apartment. Hover, on seeing Heidi, beckoned her to come closer to ask her what she was doing. But Heidi replied to her saying, "I can't. I think my mommy is dead." Hearing these words made Hover immediately abandon what she was doing to follow Heidi in to check out the situation. In Loretta's home, Hover found Loretta lying face down, naked from the waist down and her back and hair matted in blood. Hover called the police, and the police chief Art Poloni responded to the scene. After the police arrived around 11:40 a.m. on July 31, 1990, they confirmed Loretta was dead. They found blood everywhere in the living room, and Loretta had 17 stab wounds. The investigators didn't see any sign of forced entry, which suggested that she had known her attacker. Loretta also didn't have any defensive wounds, which showed she hadn't tried to defend herself during the attack. The medical examiner also concluded that Loretta was killed with a small, narrow knife, that she had bodily fluid on her, but unfortunately, DNA testing was still in its early stages at the time. There was no CCTV camera to capture how the whole thing went down, but since there was a little girl in the home at the time of the incident, the investigators turned to her to get some answers. Heidi told the investigators that after her mom had put her in bed, she returned to tell her not to come out of her room. She also said she never heard her mother scream or struggle on the night of the murder, but she did mention something that got the investigators concerned. Heidi had told the investigators that Tom did it. The police began to search for answers as they combed the house. Eventually, they found Loretta's diary, and in it was a name similar to the name Heidi mentioned, Thomas Eagley. According to the diary, Thomas and Loretta dated for 2 months before her death, and that was the only information they could get on Thomas. There was little to nothing that the investigators could make out of the case except for a name mentioned by a 4-year-old Heidi, who was asleep at the time of the murder. But soon the police had another lead to follow. Around 9:30 p.m., Goloferno, a 10-year-old girl who lived 3 blocks away from Loretta's house, was outside her house riding her bike with her brother. On seeing that it was already getting dark, Kolo's brother left his bike and went inside the house, while Kolo was alone outside. She soon decided to go in as well, leaving her bike outside. As she walked to the main door, a man attacked her from behind, gripping her and covering her mouth with his palm. Luckily, Kolo was able to get her mouth out of the kidnapper's grip, and she let out a deafening scream. The man got scared and left Kolo to take to his heels. Kolo was able to see her attacker and also the direction he went. She told the police he ran in the direction of Loretta's house. Later at the police station, Thomas Eagley's picture was included in the lineup, as he was already a suspect in a murder case on the same night. Kolo pointed out Thomas as the person who tried to kidnap her, and so Thomas was brought in for questioning. The investigators believed that the case of Kolo and Loretta were related. They questioned Thomas on August 1, 1970, based on the 2 incidences separately, and he denied his involvement in them. Thomas said on the night of the homicide, he hitched a ride with some teenagers and they later dropped him off when they got to Price at a fast food joint where he had hamburgers. He said he then went to a bar called Highway Rendezvous on Springland Road around 11:30 p.m., and after that he went to his home. He said he didn't see Loretta that day. The investigators visited the bar to ask if they truly saw Thomas that night, and the owner of the bar confirmed that she saw him and that he was a bit skittish, nervous, and had red speckles on his shirt. The investigators asked Thomas about the red speckles mentioned on his shirt, as he told them it must have been paint, as he had been painting all day. Regardless of his statement, the investigators collected the clothing Thomas told them he was wearing that night, and he collected his hair, blood, and fingerprint samples too. With that, investigators believed they had enough probable cause to arrest Thomas. And they did. Thomas was arrested when he lived in a motel in Helper, Utah, with his girlfriend, who was 8 months pregnant. But during the preliminary hearing on November 5, 1970, prosecutors brought in witnesses that provided an alibi for Thomas. The prosecutor said the fiber evidence was similar to the rug that Loretta had in her home. But that was not enough, as Thomas was known to have visited Loretta in her home before the incident. However, because Colofenel could identify Thomas as the man who tried to abduct her, he was charged with attempted kidnapping, and so he spent 90 days in jail. After Thomas's jail time, he was released back into society, and in 1971, Thomas moved to Rockford, Colorado, but still, Loretta's case remained unsolved. For years, Heidi dealt with the trauma of her mother's death. She would talk about the incident to her grandmother, who had immediately taken her in after her mother died. She continuously told her grandmother that she was unsure that Tom killed her mother and everything Heidi said, her grandma wrote down in a journal. Heidi also told her grandmother that Tom always slapped and hit Loretta and that he was always mean to her. Soon the adults in the house tried to make Heidi forget about the incident and stopped her from talking about it. Although Heidi stopped talking about it, she never forgot about what happened to her mother in 1970. As Heidi grew, she understood that Loretta must have endured the severity of the attack because she wanted to protect her, and because of that, Heidi determined that she owed her mother justice and she would get it for her. Decades passed and Heidi moved on with her life, but never for once forgot about her mother's case. Although Heidi still held her mother in her heart, she didn't really push for the case to be reopened. But one day, Heidi was inspired by a TV show called Unsolved Mysteries. She started a massive letter campaign sending them to FBI, Price City Police Department, and Carbon County Sheriff, but none of them responded. Still, she continued to write one letter after another. In 2009, 43-year-old Heidi made a post on her social media, and one of her former high school friends, David Brewer, reacted to her post. The two reconnected after a long time, and during their conversation, learned that David was working with the Carbon County Sheriff. Heidi thought this was an opportunity for her to get her mother's case reopened. She tracked David and purposely ran into him at a local arts festival so she could talk to him about her mother's cold case. David granted Heidi the audience that she needed, and in the end, after he had listened to her, David was moved by Heidi's story. At the same time, he was surprised that he had never heard of Heidi's story when they were in high school. Heidi narrated how her mother kissed her goodnight and how the door of her room later opened to reveal her mom, telling her never to come out as if she knew something bad was going to happen. She also explained how she believed that Tom had killed her mother. Heidi mentioned that though her memory was murky, she had a faint memory of what looked like Tom on her mother, either forcing her to be intimate with him or stabbing her. But what Heidi didn't hear was her mother scream. Hearing her story, David decided to help Heidi, and Lorena's case was finally reopened. David Brewer started to work on the case, but the odds were stacked against him. He tried to use the crime files, but they had been lost. All that he had was past media coverage and Heidi's murky memory. David tracked down Thomas, who was living in Rockford, Colorado, for more questioning. When he asked Thomas about what happened on the night July 30th, 1970, Thomas was able to give the details of what he ate and did on that day, but he said he couldn't remember Loretta or her name. At that moment, David was convinced that Thomas may actually be the killer, but since there was no evidence to convict him, David had to leave without arresting Thomas. David Brewer also tracked down Thomas's other-than-girlfriend, Marcia Hidego, to question her. Marcia told David that Thomas came home late the night of the murder, and he immediately took a bath with his clothes on. The next day, Thomas went to the laundromat, and when he returned home, she said Thomas was missing several clothing items. According to Marcia, she asked Thomas about his whereabouts, and he told her that he took hamburgers to a woman and her daughter. Although David could not really make something out of the information, he was more convinced that Thomas murdered Loretta. David had tried every other way, and the only thing he felt was left was exhumation, but he didn't know how Heidi would feel about exhuming her mother's corpse. But surprisingly, after David told Heidi of his thoughts, she said she would even get a shovel to dig the grave herself, if that would get justice for her mother. They proceeded with the exhumation, and their Heidi broke down so many times, but after the body was exhumed, they discovered water had damaged the whole body. So they could not get what they needed. However, they decided to exaggerate the outcome to the public by saying they had found new evidence that provided them with a lead. The news traveled far and wide, and soon David would get a phone call from a woman named Linda. Linda explained that she remembered the information she saw in the news of the exhumation on TV and decided to share it with the investigators. She told David Brewer that Loretta had in the name of the killer with her blood. A surprised David asked her how she knew this, considering that police did not allow anyone into the crime scene. Linda explained that she lived at Heidi's grandmother's house when she was in high school, which was the time of the murder. A day after the incident, Heidi's grandfather asked Linda and one of Heidi's aunts to go to Loretta's house to pack Heidi's belongings. Linda said because of that, police allowed them in, and on getting there, She saw with her own eyes a capital T and an O. This was a huge break in the case, but they needed a photo of the crime scene to prove this. David met with Heidi and explained the new information he got with her. And also expressed his pain about not being able to lay his hands on any photos of the crime scene as all were lost. And right away, Heidi remembered that a photo might be in a box of belongings that her grandmother had kept all those years. They went ahead to search her grandmother's house for the box, and in the box they searched for the photo. All that was inside the box was everything that concerned the case, including the journal where her grandmother wrote all that Heidi had said concerning the case. However, the most striking item was a photo of Heidi standing next to the outline of her mother's body. The picture was a really disturbing one. Anyone would have questioned why they were taking pictures of young Heidi next to her mother's pool of blood. But it turned out this photo would be of great use in the future. In the photo was Heidi and her mother's blood, with the two letters T and O in it. David Brewer began to piece the puzzle together. Reading the journal, he saw that Heidi mentioned how mean Tom was to her mom and the fact that she told everyone that Tom did it. And the most important thing, Loretta was trying to write the name of her killer with her blood as she struggled for her life, and the last thing she could write was an O. But even with this photo, the detectives needed more to capture Thomas Eagley, who was now believed to be Tom in this case. The case came to a halt again until someone decided to be of great help to the investigators. A woman named Lisa Carter called the police department to tell them she was Thomas Eagley's neighbor. She said Thomas came to her after she saw the exhumation video asking if she could watch his dogs, as the police could come for him anytime soon. Lisa Carter also believed that Thomas was Loretta's killer, so she offered to help in the case. She asked that the police allow her to wear a recording device to get Thomas's confession. The police agreed and an arrangement was made. Lisa approached Thomas and lied to him that her husband had been training to be a detective in Utah. She told Thomas that he had been a topic of discussion as he was already known as the murderer of Loretta Jones. All these words got to Thomas eagerly, but he didn't confess as he still couldn't trust Lisa. But after 2 days of trying to gain Thomas's trust, on July 26, 2016, he started to talk to Lisa about what happened on the night of July 30, 1970. Thomas said he knocked on the door to Loretta's home and she let him in. He said he was in her house for intimacy, but Loretta turned him down, making him feel so worthless. He said Loretta left him in the living room to get something in the kitchen, and after she came back, he reached for a small knife and stabbed her. After stabbing Loretta, Thomas went ahead to get intimate with her, claiming that it was consensual. A confused Lisa asked how it was consensual after Loretta refused. But Thomas said throughout the time, Loretta never said no to him. She then asked him what happened after, and he told her that after getting intimate with Loretta, he lost it completely, and that was when he slit her throat. According to Lisa, Thomas said all these words without being sorry for all that he did. It appeared he only cared about his own safety. That confession was all the investigators needed to arrest Thomas. Not much is known about Thomas Eagley, according to Loretta's sister, Carolyn Kendall. She only knew that Loretta dated Thomas one time. A blind date. Loretta told Carolyn that she didn't like Thomas, so she didn't want to have anything to do with him. This explains why Loretta refused Thomas's advances that night. 76-year-old Thomas Eagley was a local drifter who had lived in many places before and after he murdered Loretta. He never had a stable home life. He lived with many women and had been married 3 times. He had 5 children, but spent most of his time by himself. In August 2016, Thomas Eagley was charged in the 7th District Court with the legal equivalent of first-degree felony murder, as well as forced intimacy of first-degree felony. Thomas's official charge was criminal homicide murder in the 2nd degree, which was a statutory offense that applied to killing at the time under Utah law. Thomas was arrested without incident in Rocky Ford, Colorado, on a $1 million warrant issued on August 18, 2016. Thomas pleaded guilty to the murder, and his assault case was dropped. He was then sentenced to 10 years to life on November 22, 2016. Thomas never passed a remorseful comment except a written statement read by his attorney, David Allred, which read that he was sorry for what he did, But that didn't seem true after Thomas expressed that he believed he should be let go, since he hadn't committed any crime since he killed Loretta. He said in court that he could not understand why the family of the deceased chose to reopen a case of 46 years ago. It seemed like Thomas wasn't sorry for what he did, even after 46 years. According to Thomas, he didn't know that Heidi was in the room when he killed her mother. Loretta knew this, and it explains why she never struggled or screamed when he was stabbing her. Most likely, Thomas wouldn't have spared Heidi if he knew she was in the room. After he was sentenced, he complained to the judge that he didn't like his jail, which was the state prison in Salt Lake County, as it didn't allow visitors. The judge told him he could file an appeal. Heidi, who held in her pain for over 4 decades, had the opportunity to say all that she had in mind to her mother's killer. She expressed how traumatic the death of her mother was, and also spoke about how she wished Thomas Eagley would rot in jail and never have to see his loved ones again. She also said she'd make sure that he never walks free, even if he was eligible for parole after 10 years. Even though others called it closure, Heidi called it justice, saying nothing could give her the closure and relief she needed. The fact that justice was served meant everything to her. As we come to the end of this heartbreaking story of Loretta Jones' death, we are reminded that time does not heal every wound, especially the wound of the heart. We are also reminded of the evil that resides in the heart of man. Looking back at the clean slate that Thomas Eagley had with the law, we are left with the thought-provoking question, like why he chose to orphan Heidi at such a young age. A quick question before we go. What do you think about how Loretta's case was initially handled? Do you think law enforcement would have done better considering all they had available at the time? Linda Slayton was born in 1950 in Alabama, United States. She was raised by devoted parents and had a younger sister named Judy. Linda was kind-hearted and ambitious from a young age. She made a lot of friends by constantly attempting to assist others. She later wed Frank, and the two of them had 2 sons, Jeff and Tim. But as time passed, their marriage grew more and more troubled. Frank began abusing his wife and kids after becoming addicted to alcohol. Linda ultimately made the decision to relocate to Florida with her sons. They made their home in Lakeland, where Linda's sister and parents were already residing. Setting aside all of her time to support her sons, Linda rented a home in a lakeside community. Linda worked at a number of jobs, but she was never wealthy. She occasionally had to sell her possessions in order to pay her bills. Because she could not even afford a car, Jeff, her older son, had to commute by bicycle. Tim, her younger son, was a football player and frequently had to ask his coach for a lift home from practice in order to avoid having to walk. Linda made it her mission to spend as much time and energy as possible with her sons, even in the face of financial hardship. She tried to make sure their childhood was full of happy memories by taking them on walks, taking them to concerts of their favorite bands, and so on. When Linda was 31 years old, on September 3, 1981, in the evening, she waited for Tim to get done with his practice before accompanying him to the neighbor's small family celebration. When Jeff got home, he wanted to have dinner, but the refrigerator was empty. After becoming enraged with his mother, he rode his bicycle to his grandparents' residence on the opposite side of town. After the entire family got home, Jeff got into a fight with his mother about the empty refrigerator. But in the end, they said goodnight to one another and went to bed. The next morning, received a visit from her sister, who also lived in the same complex, inviting her over for coffee. When she knocked on the door, nobody answered. Thinking Linda had gone somewhere, the woman turned around to leave when she noticed the bedroom window was open. When she went to look inside, she saw Linda lying on the other side of the bed. The woman screamed and ran to the neighbors to report what she had seen immediately. She only needed to take one glance at her sister's face to know that she was dead. When detectives got to their home, they started looking over the scene of the crime. With a wire hanger around her neck and her clothes half down, Linda lay on her bed. Based on the evidence, the police surmised that the victim had been attacked and strangled by an unidentified man who had entered her room. Soon after, forensic specialists discovered a palm print on the windowsill supporting this theory. Since the apartment lacked air conditioning, Linda frequently left it open, which allowed the murderer easy access. The victim's oldest son woke up from all the noise while the detectives were at the crime scene. After escorting him outside, the detectives broke the devastating news of his mother's passing. They woke up his younger brother later and escorted him out. But as the boy was passing by his mother's room, a second policeman came out and Tim saw his mother's body through the open door. He instantly froze and the officer had to pull him away. Tim, who was 12, and Jeff, who was 15, were completely shocked. At first, they were unable to accept their mother's death. When the investigators were able to speak with the brother later, he said they had not heard anything or even woken up that night. The detectives thought this was odd, even though they had their own rooms. Given the brutality of the murder and the excellent acoustics of the building, loud noises ought to have been audible from the victim's room. The neighbors were questioned by the police, but they had also heard nothing. That day, none of the complex's occupants had seen any suspicious people. After examining the victim's body, medical professionals concluded that she had been abused. Although they were able to remove the murderer's biological material, DNA analysis was not yet possible. The experts verified that Linda's death was due to strangulation. Therefore, the investigators were left with very little evidence to work with. They could only benefit from the palm print if they could locate a suspect and compare them. Linda's sons went to live with their grandparents. They continued to live in shock and continual fear of being pursued by the unidentified killer. Because of the extreme fear, their grandfather sat with a rifle in the living room while they slept in the same room as their grandmother. The investigators thought the kids were not in danger, though. They believed that the killer had to have known the victim and that the crime was motivated only by sexual desire. Following their conversation with Linda's family, they discovered that her ex-husband had a violent past. He was the top suspect right away, but the police soon discovered that the man was not there when the murder happened. Investigators later learned that Linda had begun dating a particular man not long before she passed away. They were able to track him down, but he also had a strong alibi. The fingerprints of all the victim's neighbors were compared by the detectives with the sample found on the windowsill. They then tried the same procedure on all the men who had previously been found guilty living in Lakeland, but they were unable to find any matches. After Linda's sons began to heal over several weeks following the murder, their family finally concluded that sending them back to school would be the best course of action. It did eventually assist the brothers, as they started talking to friends once more and eventually resumed a regular life. Tin returned to the football team because his mother had always been pleased with his achievements. He put a picture of his team in his bedroom a month after she passed away as a memento of how his mother had inspired him to pursue his dreams. In the meantime, the detectives were unable to identify a viable suspect and came to a standstill. They made the decision to start over and reevaluate why the sons had not heard any screams or indications of a struggle. After going over Jeff's statements, the police discovered that on the day Linda was killed, he got into a fight with her. The teenager himself added that he and his mother had verbal arguments on a regular basis. This led the investigators to wonder if Jeff had murdered his mother. They summoned him in for questioning and once more posed a variety of queries. Jeff quickly learned that he was under suspicion from the investigators for the crime. The detectives persisted in their pressure even after he denied any involvement. Jeff accepted their offer to take a polygraph exam. Although the polygraph operator did not find any evidence of deceit, the police were not willing to give up. Not too long after, they summoned him back for interrogation and even made arrangements to have him hypnotized. Jeff was under constant pressure, and the investigators even accused him of killing his mother by strangulation. The family of Linda reached a breaking point as a result, and they forbade the police from speaking to Jeff and insisted that they concentrate on finding the true murderer. Jeff consented to take another polygraph test in spite of this, and after receiving positive results, he was at last written off as a suspect. After that, the case did not move forward for a long time. Tim and Jeff grew up, gained employment, and began their own families. Their mother's murder continued to haunt them, but each time they reached out to the investigators, they were met with the same response. Nothing had changed in the case. Scientists took a DNA sample from the biological material on the victim's body in March 1999. When a new detective was brought on to the case 2 years later, he compared it with samples from every suspect, including Linda's 2 sons, but there were no matches. There were no results even when it was compared to the FBI database. When Jeff first met this detective, he found out that he had known him for a long time. It turned out that the men and their mutual friends went bowling together on a regular basis. When they spoke, the investigator assured Jeff that he would do everything in his power to solve the case. Tim and Jeff learned of another unsolved crime that had been going on for a long time around the same period. Following extensive media coverage, fresh information surfaced that helped apprehend the offender. At that point, the brothers made the decision to talk to reporters about their family's tragedy. They conducted a thorough interview, and the local newspapers published the story. The detective received an intriguing lead in September of 2001. He discovered that a year after Linda's murder, a man by the name of Jimmy Ulmer had kidnapped a young woman through her bedroom window. He was sentenced to 80 years in prison for this crime. The fact that this individual resided in the same apartment building as Linda, only a short distance from her home, added to the intrigue at the time of her murder. Since it was non-existent at the time of Ulmer's arrest, criminals' DNA had not yet been added to a shared database. The man himself died in 1996, and no biological samples remained. But when the investigator got in touch with the offender's mother, she gave some personal items from which the specialists were able to remove the sample. Sadly, the results did not match the killer's DNA, but the investigator was not about to give up. He kept in touch with Linda's sons, kept looking for new suspects, and repeatedly asked the FBI to check the killer's DNA sample against every database they could find. Sadly, he had health issues in 2015, which made him retire even though he had promised to see the case through to the end. Jeff and Tim had been so close to accepting that their mother's killer would never be found by then. But when Cease Moore, a well-known genetic genealogy specialist, took up the case in 2019, new hope materialized. She obtained the murderer's DNA sample, uploaded it to open databases, and started looking for matches. Usually, these databases can even assist in locating the DNA owner's most distant relatives, who may reside in different regions of the globe and be completely unaware of one another. By using this information, one can follow their family tree, look for shared ancestors, eliminate thousands of relatives, and determine who the DNA owner is. Moore was able to identify one family that was residing in the area at the time of the murder. After carrying out all of this intensive investigation, she came to the conclusion that the only member of that family who met all the criteria was the one who was most likely the murderer. He was someone the detectives had come across in previous reports as soon as they heard his name. The man was Tim's football coach, Joseph Clinton Mills, and he would often give him a lift home after practice. Although he had never been on the list of suspects in 1981, he had given a statement over the phone to the police after dropping Tim off at home that day. The idea that Mills might be the murderer was not even entertained by any of the detectives. Since he was only 20 years old and there was no evidence at all against him at the time, the police did not compare his fingerprints and DNA to samples that were discovered at the crime scene. The investigators made the decision to withhold this discovery's disclosure from Jeff and Tim. They had to confirm that Mills was actually responsible for their mother's murder first. After reading his biography, they discovered that Mills was detained in 1984 on suspicion of forging a will. His fingerprints were obtained, and they are still preserved in a paper archive. After comparing them to the victim's windowsill fingerprints, experts discovered a perfect match. They eventually found out who the likely murderer was 38 years later. The detectives proceeded to the last phase as soon as this information was discovered, requesting a DNA sample from Mills so they could compare it with the biological material taken from the victim's body. They found out the man was still residing in the same home as he had in 1981. At this point, Mills was 58 years old, married, had a small business, and children and grandchildren. For several weeks, the detectives kept an eye on him in the hopes of obtaining something that had his DNA. It might have been a bottle, a coffee cup, a cigarette butt, or anything else. But since they were never given the chance, the cops made the covert decision to take his trash. They gave the bag to the lab, where professionals quickly found an object that matched his DNA. The results came back quickly. Mills' DNA exactly matched the sample that was discovered on Linda's body. Following that, the detectives met with Linda's sons to update them on the investigation status. While they were both taken aback, Tim found it more difficult to accept. He was shocked to learn that his football coach was the same monster that had murdered his mother. In addition to the fact that Tim looked up to and respected him, Mills still gave him rides home from practice after the murder. The man gave him unceasing encouragement and inquired about any updates regarding his mother's case. For a long time, Tim's old bedroom featured a picture of his football team with the monster that killed his mother standing right behind them. When Mills was arrested that same year, he handled himself calmly and did not even inquire as to the nature of his charges. Upon being interrogated and questioned about Linda's murder, he denied any involvement. He said he dropped him off and headed out. Mills claimed he had never been inside their home, but the investigators knew this was untrue. The suspect abruptly altered his account of what happened after they told him about the DNA and fingerprint match. According to Mills, Linda asked him to sneak into her bedroom through the window that evening for a private conversation. She then requested that he give her a light hanger choke. But Mills misjudged his strength and killed her. The investigators, understandably, were skeptical of this account at first. In light of all the available data, their theory was far more likely to be correct. Mills had seen Tim's mother on multiple occasions and could have targeted her as a victim. He dropped the boy off on the night of the murder, and the boy went straight to a neighbor's house with his mother for a party. Mills drove a distance away from their house, taking advantage of the fact that no one would be home. And then he returned on foot, breaking through Linda's bedroom window and hiding in the closet. He waited for everyone to go to sleep for several hours. He took a wire hanger out of that same closet and used it as a murder weapon. He violently attacked the victim before exiting the house through the window. Mills was charged with the murder and the case was sent to court based on all the evidence that was available. For this kind of offense, Mills could have received the death penalty in the state of Florida. However, on February 9, 2022, he made the decision to reach a settlement with the prosecution in order to avoid this outcome. He admitted to the murder, but he was exempt from sharing the specifics of the crime under the terms of the agreement. This fact did not sit well with Linda's sons. Tim yelled at his coach in the courtroom, demanding to know why he had taken his mother away from him, but the man just stared down and said nothing. When given the chance to make a closing statement, Mills only said, "I am a good person. I am not who they are trying to portray me as." Even though this infuriated the brothers even more, in the end, they were appreciative of the investigators for solving the case and identifying the murderer. Mills received a life sentence without the chance of release. Following the verdict's announcement, Jeff and Tim pledged to live moral lives and devote themselves to their families because they knew their mother would have approved of it. At Israel's southernmost point on the Red Sea sits the resort city of Eilat. It is renowned for having warm weather, crystal clear waters, and lovely beaches. Since the streets are rarely completely empty at night and Elliot's crime rate is still relatively low, residents feel safe walking around the city. However, this was not the case in the early 2000s when a mother lost her daughter to this posh town. Following her military service in Ashdod, Israel, on June 14, 2003, 21-year-old Margarita Levy moved to Eilat in the southern region of the country. Margarita relocated to the southern city with the intention of working as a waitress and saving enough money to enroll in Hebrew University of Jerusalem and pursue a nursing degree. Only a few days after arriving in Eilat, on June 18th of that year, Margarita's mother, Olga Levy, contacted the Eilat authorities to report that she had not been able to contact her daughter for a few hours and was concerned that something was wrong. On Wednesday, June 18, 2003, Olga reported to the police that she had received a call from Margarita. Aware that Margarita would be living alone, Olga, who was already under a lot of stress from her job, expressed her worries. Margarita reassured her that everything was well and attempted to calm her down. Margarita informed her mother she was heading to the beach to unwind before hanging up. The question of which beach Margarita was heading to was overlooked by Olga, who was preoccupied with work. That was their final exchange of words. When Olga got home from work in the evening, she tried to call Margarita again, but her phone was off. Olga called her daughter repeatedly over the course of the following few hours, but she was unable to get through. Olga's statement prompted the Eilat Police Department to begin looking for Margarita. On June 19, 2003, the following day, in the Yadalum neighborhood of the city, a young woman's body was discovered in a park by a passerby. The woman was face down on her stomach, barely clothed, and her body was in an appalling condition. After learning of the horrifying discovery, the police went to the park to look into the young woman's corpse. A towel was draped over her head, and it was layered with blankets. She had suffered severe injuries. She had a stab wound in her chest in addition to wounds to her head, face, and upper limbs. The body was later identified as Margarita's later that day. To investigate Margarita's murder, the Eilat police formed a special investigation team. However, the investigators initially struggled to determine the true circumstances of the murder. In an effort to gather information that might help solve the murder, the police asked the public for assistance as they were having trouble finding a lead in the case. Things began to improve after 2 weeks, and they eventually had a lead. They asked a man named Sergei Agranov, who was acquainted with Margarita, to come speak with them after being released from military service in Migdal Hammock. Sergei worked as a salesperson in an Isla pizzeria. Although he denied killing Margarita, Sergei admitted to the police that he knew her. Following his testimony, he was taken into custody and questioned under duress. Even after the police searched his house, they found nothing that would have connected Sergei to Margarita's death. The public defender's office represented Sergei in a formal court proceeding concerning his involvement in Margarita's case. The lawyer maintained that although Sergei was acquainted with Margarita, he had a solid alibi that proved he was in his apartment with his roommates during the hours leading up to the murder. In court, the police disputed the assertions made by Sergei's lawyer, claiming that Margarita's body had not been discovered at the murder scene. They suspected that she had been killed somewhere else and that the murderer had taken her body and moved it to the park. Living close to the park, where it would have been easy for someone to dispose of the body if they were staying nearby, was what initially raised suspicions about Sergei. Sergei's detention was extended. The judge reasoned that there was a reasonable doubt linking him to Margarita's murder. Nevertheless, Sergei was freed from custody after just 2 weeks, because the investigators were unable to locate any additional evidence to support their charges against him. Now that Sergei was free, there were no leads for the detectives to pursue, and the case finally fell apart and became unsolved. The murder case was never closed, even after a long period of time. Devoted to identifying Margarita's killer, the investigators never gave up. They repeatedly tried to get a DNA profile from the items they discovered at the crime scene next to Margarita's body. A gag order on the murder investigation was imposed by the Magistrates' Court in Eilat on May 18, 2023, marking a significant turn in the case. This prohibited the individuals handling the case from providing any public information about it. The production of DNA evidence has advanced significantly technologically over the years, and investigators from the Israel Police National Headquarters Forensic Identification Laboratory have kept up with this development by continuously reviewing evidence and findings gathered during unsolved case investigations. Following several months, the forensic team was able to create a DNA profile that pointed them in the direction of a possible suspect after re-examining the evidence in Margarita's case. The man who was identified as the suspect was 51-year-old Jaffa resident Sami Abu Al-Asal. Sani Abu was a 31-year-old father of 5 children in 2003. At the time of Margarita's murder, he resided in Eilat and worked in a bar in the city's tourist district. The Eilat District Police maintained the investigation's secrecy despite the finding and the noteworthy development. In order to obtain conclusive evidence of Sani Abu's role in Margarita's murder, the detectives started gathering evidence against him. During a 10-month undercover investigation, the police discovered that Sami Abu had attacked another woman in Eilat in July 2003, approximately a month and a half after Margarita Levy's murder. For this offense, he was apprehended and found guilty. As a result of Sami Abu's 13-year prison sentence for this offense, his DNA was added to the database. Sani Abu's DNA was compared to the sample discovered on Margarita Levy's body using the DNA database, and the investigators discovered that the two samples entirely matched. On May 14, 2023, 51-year-old Sani Abu Alessal was taken into custody after the charges against him were ultimately verified by the evidence. Premeditated murder, aggravated murder, and sodomy were the charges brought against him. After kidnapping Margarita, Sami Abu took her to a remote location and attacked her. He struck Margarita in the face, head, and upper limbs later on, and attempted to strangle her. Sami Abu gave Margarita a chest stab to make sure she was dead. Margarita's body was then covered in blankets, and her head also wrapped in a towel. Sami Abu then fastened electrical cables around the blankets. After tying the cables so that they would force the blankets tighter around her body, he threw her corpse into the middle of a nearby park and ran away. Sergei Agranov, the initial suspect in Margarita's case, was once more placed under arrest for approximately 2 weeks in order for the authorities to investigate any possible relationship between him and Sani Abu Al-Assal. Sergei was fully exonerated of any suspicion after it was determined that there was no connection between the two and that Sani Abu committed the heinous act alone. The investigation's latest development was shared with Margarita's family. Margarita's mother, Olga Levy, expressed her thoughts regarding the progress made in her daughter's case. She reported being overcome with emotion upon learning that Margarita's killer had been apprehended. She was now at peace because the monster that killed her daughter was finally going to pay for his crimes. But Olga expressed uncertainty about whether she would want to watch the entire trial. It was a mixed feeling. The sights and sounds of the day Margarita was killed would resurface just by gazing at Soniavu. Olga was attempting to move on from her past traumas and was not interested in going through them again. For 20 years, from 2003 to the present, Olga expressed her gratitude to the Eilat Police Department for their commitment and diligence. All she could hope for now was that Sam Abu would receive the proper penalty for his transgressions. On January 13, 1972, life in the Randall household was proceeding as usual. 32-year-old Juanita Randall was busy in the kitchen preparing a meal for the family, while her 9-year-old daughter Debbie Randall was bubbling with excitement. Debbie was all set to join her friends for a fun time at the nearby playground, just a short 2-block stroll from their home. But before Debbie could leave, Juanita had a simple request. She asked Debbie to pick up some washing powder from the laundromat across the road on her way back. Little did she know, as she bid her daughter goodbye with a smile, that this would be the last time she'd see her cherished child. Debbie, full of happiness, headed off to play with her friends, but sadly, she never made it back home. What could have happened to young Debbie on that ordinary day in 1972? And where did she disappear to after leaving for the playground? Marietta is a city located in Georgia, USA, with a population of approximately 60,000 people. The community in Marietta is known for its diversity and strong sense of civic pride. Residents here often engage in various community activities and events, creating a welcoming and vibrant atmosphere. The city offers a mix of historic charm and modern amenities, making it an attractive place to live for a diverse group of individuals and families. Marietta's population rate reflects its appeal as a desirable community in the state of Georgia. Let's start the story and take a journey back in time to August 21, 1962, when a lovely little girl came into the world. Debbie Randall was born to John Randall and Juanita Wheeler Randall in the cozy town of Marietta, Georgia. She attended Pine Forest Elementary School in Georgia, where she was in 3rd grade, and her kind and gentle nature made her a beloved friend among her classmates. Beyond school walls in the tight-knit community, she was adored by everyone, and people often brought dolls for her when they visited her home as tokens of their affection. Debbie also had a big brother named Marvin Randall, and their bond was something truly special. Marvin loved his little sister and would always go above and beyond to make her happy. Whatever Debbie wished for, Marvin made it happen, highlighting the strong and caring connection they shared as siblings. Debbie was a source of joy for her family, and she had grand dreams and a heart filled with adventure. However, her life was cut short and never truly got the chance to fully chase those dreams and live life to the fullest. It was an ordinary evening on January 13, 1972, when Debbie was at her home in Marietta, Georgia, with her mother Juanita and her brother Marvin, who was feeling a bit under the weather, so he was resting in his room. It was shaping up to be an ordinary evening. Juanita was in the kitchen, busy preparing dinner while John, Debbie's father, had yet to return home. Suddenly, with a burst of enthusiasm, Debbie went to her room, quickly dressed herself, and returned back to her mother with an eager request to go play at the nearby playground with her friends. This playground was just a stone's throw away, a mere half-block and a quick 57 feet from their house. Right across the road, there was a laundromat. Juanita remembered that she had forgotten to grab some washing powder from there. So, she'd granted Debbie's request to play. She asked her to run a small errand. "While you're out, dear," she said, "please don't forget to pick up the washing powder we need." With a cheerful nod, Debbie happily ventured outside to join her friends at the playground, and didn't forget to promise her mother that she'd return home before dinner time. Little did they know that this simple request would mark the beginning of a mystery that would haunt their lives for years to come. The playground was just a mere 5-minute stroll for Debbie. Her usual routine was to play for about an hour and then head back home. So Juanita naturally thought she'd be back in roughly an hour and a half. However, when 2 hours slipped by with no sign of Debbie, Juanita began to wonder. She thought, maybe she's at the laundromat, imagining the crowd there was causing the delay. But as 3 hours came and went, the sun sat below the horizon. Juanita's concern grew stronger. This was far from the normal. As the evening darkened, Juanita's worry also deepened. Debbie had always been punctual and never missed her curfew before. By 9:45 p.m., when John, Debbie's father, finally arrived home, Juanita couldn't contain her concern any longer. She anxiously asked him if he had seen or been with Debbie on his way home. But John's face mirrored her distress when he said that he had no information about Debbie's whereabouts. The worry that had begun as a tiny spark now blazed into a full-fledged concern for their beloved daughter. At the moment listening to the voice, Martin also emerged from his room, and he couldn't help but notice the worry etched across his parents. Being concerned, he inquired about what was happening. Juanita, torn between protecting her ailing son and the growing anxiety over Debbie's absence, finally broke down in tears. She told Martin that Debbie hadn't returned home, and she and John were going out to search for her. With a heavy heart, Juanita asked Martin to stay behind, keeping an eye on the house and let them know immediately if Debbie returned. It was a moment of heart-wrenching decisions for the family. Fear and confusion swept through the neighborhood as the Randall family sprang into action to find young Debbie. Martin, being a caring older brother, couldn't bear to stay home and do nothing. He roamed the neighborhood, approaching people with questions burning in his mind. "Have you seen Debbie? Do you know where she is?" The response was unanimous shock. No one could believe that their beloved little Debbie was missing without a trace. Some recalled glimpsing her as she left her house, but no one had seen her since. Meanwhile, Juanita and John hurried to the playground where Debbie went to play with her friends, but it was eerily deserted. All the children had already returned to their homes. Their next stop was the laundromat, where Juanita had asked Debbie to fetch washing powder. But it too was closed by then. The minutes ticked away, and every empty road and quiet street they searched seemed to amplify the silence of their daughter's absence. Where could their beloved Debbie have disappeared to? At a moment, Juanita stumbled upon a box of washing powder scattered on the road that led to their home. It was a moment of realization that something terribly wrong might have happened to her daughter. Overwhelmed by worry, Juanita couldn't hold back her tears any longer. She made the difficult decision to file a missing person report, determined to do everything in her power to find her daughter. However, the police explained that, as less than 24 hours had passed since Debbie went missing, they couldn't officially file the report just yet. Still, they promised to do their best to locate her. Despite this devastating setback, the Randall family was touched by the outpouring support from the community during this difficult time. The community sprang into action, launching a citywide search effort which involved approximately 4,000 volunteers. Martin also took to the streets, posting flyers with a desperate plea for information about his missing sister. Debbie, who had a fondness for playing baseball with her brother, was dearly missed by her family, and Martin hoped that someone, somewhere, had seen or knew something that could bring her back home. At the same time, the police were equally determined to find Debbie. They visited the laundromat where the owner confirmed that Debbie had picked up the washing powder as instructed. But the question was, what could have transpired in those mere 5 minutes between her visit to the laundromat and her disappearance? The police also interviewed all of Debbie's friends who had been at the playground that day, but none had any information about her whereabouts. 16 long days passed, and yet there was no sign of Debbie. Juanita and John were still hoping and waiting anxiously for their beloved daughter to return home safely. Among the dedicated searchers were a group of Southern Tech students who tirelessly assisted the police. After 16 days, on January 29, 1972, their unwavering efforts eventually led them to a tragic discovery on Johnson Ferry Road. On the other side of the woods, they found Debbie's lifeless, partially unclothed body. Her body bore the harrowing signs of a fierce struggle, as if she had fought with all her might until her very last breath to defend herself. It appeared that the heartless killer had used Debbie's own coat to silence her cries for help. Investigators believed that the perpetrator must have been stalking Debbie for some time, patiently waiting for the right moment to strike. He eventually seized the opportunity, abducting and subjecting her to a horrifying ordeal at various locations, before ultimately discarding her lifeless body in the woods. This heartbreaking discovery left the community in deep sorrow, and Debbie's parents were overwhelmed with the grief at the sight of their beloved daughter's lifeless form. The coroner's examination revealed that she had been strangled and assaulted, bearing deep marks on her body that hinted at the immense pain she endured. During this examination, a significant discovery was made: an unidentified hair possibly belonging to her assailant. This find had the potential to be a breakthrough in the case. However, due to the limitations of medical technology in the 1970s, there was little they could do with the hair at the time. So it was carefully preserved, waiting for future advancements that might one day help uncover the identity of the person responsible for Debbie's tragic demise. As the days turned into months, detectives tirelessly pursued hundreds of leads, yet each one seemed to lead nowhere. Despite their dedicated efforts, the police found themselves in a frustrating loop, unable to uncover the vital clues needed to solve the case. These turn of events left the Randall family with haunting questions. What truly transpired on that tragic night? Who bore the responsibility for their daughter's demise? They grappled with not only the profound loss of their cherished Debbie, but also with the agonizing frustration of justice eluding them. For nearly 28 years, the puzzle of Debbie's murder remained without a solution. However, in 2001, fate intervened, giving the case a new chance. Detective Morris Nix, who couldn't shake the memory of this unsolved mystery, began to comb through old cold case files. As he pored over those documents, he stumbled upon Debbie's murder case. Diving back into the details, he felt like there were concealed aspects that hadn't been thoroughly examined. The initial 1972 investigation. Following his instincts, Detective Morse made the choice to reopen the case. He retrieved the evidence box, which had been tucked away for years, and inside it, he found an unidentified strand of hair that had been preserved with care. The FBI conducted numerous tests on it, but even with their efforts, they couldn't determine whose hair it was. The technology at the time just wasn't that advanced enough, so they decided to again wait for the day to finally bring the breakthrough in the case. This case stayed unresolved, but in 2015, it gained momentum again when Detective Morris volunteered for the Cobb County Cold Case Unit. He brought fresh eyes in the aid of advanced medical science, determined to crack the mystery that had baffled the police 46 years earlier. With the help of the media coverage which shone a spotlight on this old case, a woman named Sandra Walker emerged from the shadows. She had been one of the kids who played with Debbie on that fateful evening of January 13, 1972. Sandra bravely recounted her memories to the police. Although fear had kept her silent at the time, those memories were etched in her mind. She recounted nearly being run over by the man's speeding vehicle and the sensation of his eyes locked under her through the rear-view mirror. She could still hear Debbie's desperate screams and see her kicking as the man forcibly pushed her back into his truck. All the memories still haunted her to this day. To engage the entire community and reignite their memories of that fateful night, the police enlisted the help of a graphic designer. With the street now transformed into a bus terminal, Jessica Knoll took a fresh perspective on the case. Freelance artist Amanda would dedicated months to crafting a visual representation of Debbie's last moments. Given Debbie's fondness for dolls, she chose to depict her story in the form of a doll, with her killer portrayed as the menacing monster in this tragic tale. This creative approach aimed to draw attention of the community once again and help uncover potential clues in the case. John, Debbie's father, held onto every newspaper article that recounted her disappearance, a constant reminder of the lingering sorrow and the mysteries that were left unsolved in their hearts. In the meantime, Detective Morris took a significant step by sending a piece of cloth, a circular one adorned with floral prints, which had been found on Debbie's body, to the Sorensen Forensic Lab for a fresh round of DNA analysis. Thanks to advancements in technology, they managed to construct a partial profile of an unknown male. However, they faced some challenges, but fortunately in 2019, with additional funding from the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council, renewed DNA testing opened up new avenues for further investigation. Finally, in 2023, a breakthrough emerged as the police turned to the power of genetic genealogy. They enlisted DNA Labs International to conduct more tests aiming to create AS&P's profile by combing through public records and police resources. When the DNA matched to an individual, the investigators wasted no time and began building a family tree, painstakingly tracing down as many members from the assailant's family as possible. For this, the police went a step further, by reaching out to all of the killer's family members and requesting their DNA samples. To their surprise, the family agreed and cooperated willingly by providing their DNA for testing. When all the necessary tests were completed, the DNA evidence found on Debbie was a perfect match. The killer was identified as William B. Rose from Mableton. However, the twist was that Rose took his own life in 1974, just 2 years after he abducted and killed Debbie. At that time, he was only 24 years old. The reason behind Rose's decision to take his own life was driven by fear. Even during the previous arrest for an alcohol-related incident, he lived in constant fear, as revealed by one of his family members who spoke to the police. The authorities believed that Rose must have harbored a deep fear that one day the police might catch up to him for the terrible crime he committed. To avoid facing the consequences, he chose to end his life before that could happen. Remarkably, during the initial investigation, Rose had never even appeared on the police's radar, making his identity as Debbie's killer all the more unexpected. While it seemed unlikely that Rose and Debbie were close acquaintances, there was a connection through their families, as both resided in the same complex. In that neighborhood, children often played together on a nearby playground. This suggested the possibility that Rose might have seen Debbie on previous occasions, and when the opportunity presented itself, he carried out his sinister plan. To definitively confirm Rose as the real killer, the police, with the family's consent, exhumed his body after nearly 5 decades. They conducted various tests, and the results left no room for doubt that William B. Rose was indeed the perpetrator, who tragically took the life of 9-year-old Debbie Randall in a horrific manner. The long-awaited revelation of the perpetrator's identity brought closure to the case, but it was bittersweet. Sadly, Debbie Randall's parents, Juanita and John, never learned that the mystery of their daughter's death had finally been solved. Juanita passed away in 2018 after battling with leukemia, and John followed in 2022. Losing a child, especially at such a young age, is a pain beyond words. This family had waited patiently for decades, hoping for answers. Detective Broad acknowledged that while this information provided closure, it could never replace the profound sorrow of losing Debbie Randall. After a relentless pursuit of justice for his sister spanning 5 decades, Debbie's brother Marvin expressed his heartfelt sentiments, saying, "I wish my mother was here, but I know she's in heaven now, and it's finally over. We want to say thank you to all of you for making this day possible. We wish that Debbie's soul finds eternal peace." What are your thoughts on this case? Why would Rose have killed little Debbie? Was that just because he got a chance that day? Or was it already planned? We'd love to hear from you. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.